There comes a time in every man's life when the world believes he's finished, forgotten by history, and left to fade quietly into memory. Sometimes the world is very wrong. In the mountains of ancient Norway lived Einar Skjoldsson, a 70-year-old giant who had once been called Wolfshield when jarls feared his name. Now he lived alone beside a frozen lake with two massive wolves he'd raised since they were cubs. The villagers told stories about his haul, warning children to stay away from where beasts roamed. When three desperate raiders broke through his door one winter night, they saw just an old man and thought they'd found easy prey. They didn't know about the wolves watching from the shadows. They didn't know about the warrior who still lived beneath those grey whiskers. What happens when young wolves meet the old wolf, who knows every trick they've yet to learn? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the surface of Lake Dragafell like the breath of sleeping giants, and Einar Skjoldsson stood at the edge of his wooden dock, watching the sun paint the water in shades of amber and gold. At 70 winters, his frame still commanded respect. 6 feet and 8 inches of weathered muscle and bone, broad shoulders that had once carried the weight of a kingdom's expectations. His hair, now white as fresh snow, hung in a single thick braid down his back, adorned with small iron rings that caught the early light. The ancient iron door lock of his hall bore the marks of countless storms and the passage of decades. He had forged it himself in the days when his hands were black with soot and his heart burned with the fire of youth. Now it served as more than mere security. It was a barrier between two worlds, the violent past he had left behind and the peaceful exile he had chosen. Fenrir and Skjold, his two wolves, padded silently across the frost-covered ground toward him. They were massive creatures, each weighing more than most men, with coats the color of storm clouds and eyes that held intelligence far beyond mere animal cunning. Einar had found them as cubs, barely a week old, their mother slain by hunters who feared what they did not understand. He had raised them with patience and respect, never trying to make them into dogs, but allowing them to remain wild while choosing to stay by his side. "Good morning, old friends," he murmured, his voice carrying the gravel of age and the warmth of genuine affection. Fenrir, the larger of the two, nuzzled against his weathered hand, while Skjold circled behind him, always alert, always watching the tree line for any sign of danger. The hall itself stood as a testament to both craftsmanship and memory. Built from massive pine logs that Einar had felled and shaped with his own hands, it sprawled along the lakeshore like a sleeping dragon. The roof, covered with traditional sod, had grown thick with wildflowers in the summer months, though now it lay beneath a blanket of snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning light. Carved dragons' heads adorned the corners, their wooden eyes seeming to watch over the valley with eternal vigilance. Inside, the hall told the story of a man who had lived multiple lives. The great hearth dominated the center, built from stones he had carried from the mountain slopes during his first year in exile. Above the mantelpiece hung his shield, not the ornate ceremonial piece that nobles displayed, but the scarred and dented iron disc that had turned aside countless blades in battles whose names had been forgotten by all but the saga singers. His weapons remained where he had placed them 30 years ago, arranged on wooden pegs along the eastern wall. His sword, Grimnir's tooth, lay in its leather scabbard, the blade still sharp despite the years. The axe, beside it, bore nicks and scratches that mapped the geography of old conflicts, each mark a story of survival and victory. But these were more than weapons now. They were reminders of who he had been and why he had chosen to become someone different. The western wall housed his books, a collection that would have surprised those who remembered only the warrior. Volumes of poetry, philosophy, and history shared space with practical texts on animal husbandry, metalworking, and the cultivation of medicinal herbs. He had spent his exile learning, reading by firelight when the winter nights stretched endlessly, and contemplating the nature of strength and wisdom. Einar's daily routine had evolved over the decades into a rhythm as natural as breathing. He woke before dawn, stepping outside regardless of weather to greet the day and assess the valley. The wolves accompanied him on his morning circuit, a careful inspection of the boundaries of his domain. They would check the snares he set for rabbits and ptarmigan, examine the fish traps in the lake's shallows, and ensure that no unwelcome visitors had approached during the night. The village of Ironwood lay 3 days' hard travel down the mountain paths, and its inhabitants had long ago learned to leave the old hermit alone. They told stories about him. Of course, mountain folk always did. Some claimed he was a berserker who had lost his mind to battle rage and fled to the wilderness to prevent himself from harming innocents. Others whispered that he was a fallen jarl who had been stripped of his lands and title for some unnamed transgression. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of their tales. Einar Skjoldsson had been born the third son of a minor chieftain, destined for obscurity until his older brothers fell to plague in the same terrible winter. Suddenly, heir to lands and responsibilities he had never expected, he had thrown himself into the role of warrior and leader with the desperate intensity of a man trying to prove himself worthy of an inheritance written in blood. His rise had been meteoric. By 25, he commanded his own warband. By 30, jarls sought his counsel and feared his displeasure. His tactical genius and personal prowess had made him wealthy beyond measure, and his fair treatment of both allies and enemies had earned him a reputation for honor that spread across the northern kingdoms. The wolves, now grown restless with the approaching storm he could sense in the air, began to pace around the hall's perimeter. They had inherited their mother's ability to read the weather, and Einar had learned to trust their instincts. He could smell it too, now that he paid attention, the metallic scent that preceded a heavy snowfall, the subtle shift in air pressure that made his old wounds ache. "Aye, you feel it coming," he said to Skjold, who had paused near the tree line, ears forward and alert. 3 days of snow, I'd wager. Maybe 4. The prospect didn't concern him. His stores were well stocked with smoked fish, dried meat, and preserved vegetables. The wood pile stood 8 feet high against the hall's northern wall, seasoned pine and birch that would burn clean and hot. He had survived 43 winters in this valley, and each one had taught him something new about patience and preparation. But it wasn't the storm that made him uneasy as he stood there in the gathering wind. It was something else, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, the old soldier's instinct that whispered of approaching danger. The wolves felt it too. Their behavior had changed subtly over the past several days, becoming more alert, more protective. They spent longer periods watching the mountain passes, and their sleep had grown restless. Einar trusted that instinct. It had kept him alive through campaigns that had claimed better warriors, guided him through political machinations that had destroyed cleverer men, and warned him when it was time to leave the world of jarls and kings behind. Now it spoke to him again, quiet but insistent, like the distant rumble of an avalanche still too far away to see. He made his way back to the hall, the wolves flanking him like silent guardians. Inside, he moved to the eastern wall, where his weapons waited. His hand rested briefly on Grimnir's tooth, feeling the familiar weight of the pommel, the perfect balance that had made it an extension of his will in battle. He didn't draw it, not yet, but the touch reconnected him with skills and reflexes that 30 years of peace had not entirely diminished. The afternoon brought the first snowflakes, large and lazy, drifting down like ash from some distant fire. Einar sat in his great chair before the hearth, carving a new handle for a fishing spear while the wolves dozed at his feet. The work required patience and precision, qualities that battle had never taught him but exile had refined. Each careful shave of the blade revealed more of the smooth ash wood beneath, bringing him closer to the perfect tool his vision demanded. As darkness fell, he prepared his evening meal. Fish caught that morning, roasted over the fire with herbs from his garden, accompanied by bread he had baked 3 days prior. The simple meal satisfied him in ways that royal feasts had never managed. There was something profound about food you had caught, prepared, and cooked yourself, eaten in a home you had built with your own hands. The storm arrived in earnest as he banked the fire for the night, wind howling down from the peaks and driving snow against the shuttered windows. But inside the hall, all was warmth and peace. Einar lay on his bed of furs and wool, listening to the storm's voice, while Fenrir and Skjold settled themselves near the dying fire. In the morning, he would find the tracks. 3 sets of them, barely visible in the wind-driven snow, approaching his hall from the eastern pass. The tracks of men who moved with purpose, but without the careful forest craft that would have hidden their passage from someone who knew how to read such signs. Someone was coming to his valley, and Einar Skjoldsson would soon learn whether 30 years of peace had prepared him for what they might bring. The ancient lock on his door had protected him from the world for 3 decades, but some storms, he knew, could blow down any barrier, no matter how strong the iron or how skilled the hand that had forged it. The tracks told a story Einar had hoped never to read again. 3 men, moving with the careless confidence of those who believe themselves predators in a land of prey. They had approached during the storm's peak, using the howling wind to mask their advance, but leaving behind signs that spoke clearly to someone trained in the old ways of war. He knelt in the snow beside the clearest print, his weathered fingers tracing the outline of a leather boot. The man who had made this track was tall and heavy, favoring his left leg slightly, an old injury perhaps, or simply the uneven wear of someone who spent more time fighting than walking. The second set belonged to someone smaller, quicker, whose steps showed the light tread of a scout or climber. The third man had the broad, flat-footed gait of a berserker, someone who trusted more in strength than stealth. Fenrir and Skjold had found the trail before dawn, their low growls waking Einar from dreams filled with the clash of steel and the screams of dying men. Now they paced restlessly around the perimeter of the hall, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the tree line where the tracks disappeared into the dark embrace of the pine forest. Raiders, Einar murmured to himself, speaking the word like a curse. He had known their kind once, had commanded men not unlike these 3. Young, hungry, convinced that strength and steel could take whatever they desired. The realization settled into his chest like a cold stone, carrying with it the weight of 30 years' worth of carefully maintained peace. His weathered leather map case lay on the great table where he had left it the night before, its brass corners green with age. Inside, hand-drawn charts detailed every path, every cave, every defensible position within a day's march of his hall. He had created these maps during his first years of exile, when the habits of warfare still ran strong in his blood and the fear of pursuit had haunted his dreams. The case had been a gift from King Ragnar himself, presented after the siege of Jorvik, when Einar's tactical brilliance had turned certain defeat into glorious victory. The leather bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, water stains from river crossings, burns from enemy fire arrows, and the deep scratch where a Saxon blade had nearly taken his life at the Battle of the 3 Rivers. Now it served as a reminder of why he had chosen this isolated valley, why he had hung up his sword and shield in favor of fishing nets and farming tools. The maps showed him what he already knew. His hall sat in a natural fortress, approachable by only 3 paths, each of which he could defend if necessary. But defense meant acknowledging that his peaceful exile had come to an end. Einar spread the largest map across the table's surface, weighing down the corners with smooth stones from the lakeshore. His finger traced the eastern approach, the most likely route for the raiders to take when they returned. They would come back, men like these always did. Having found his hall, they would return with more of their kind, expecting to find an easy target in the form of an isolated old man. The memory came unbidden, sharp and clear, as winter air. The last time he had faced raiders was 32 years ago, in the final battle before his self-imposed exile. 3 longships had appeared on the horizon at dawn, their red and black sails filled with the promise of violence. They had been young men then, too, convinced that their reputation and numbers would be enough to cow the defenders of Thornhaven. Einar had stood on the wooden ramparts of the coastal settlement, watching the ships approach while the villagers cowered behind him. His warband numbered only 40 men, while the raiders brought nearly twice that number. But he had possessed something they lacked: knowledge of the ground, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the terrible wisdom that came from understanding the true cost of violence. The battle had lasted less than an hour. When it ended, 2 of the 3 ships were burning on the beach, their crews dead or scattered to the winds. But among the fallen lay his shield brother Magnus, his closest friend, and the only man who had truly understood why Einar fought not for glory or gold, but for the protection of those who could not protect themselves. Magnus had died with a smile on his lips and Einar's name on his tongue, and something inside the great warrior had broken that day. The realization that even victory came with a price, too terrible to pay, had driven him to these mountains, to this self-imposed exile, where his sword could harm no one he cared about. The wolves' growling intensified, drawing him back to the present. Through the shuttered window, he could hear the distant crack of breaking branches. Someone was moving through the forest, approaching his hall with little regard for stealth. The raiders had returned sooner than he had expected, and their boldness suggested they had brought reinforcements. Einar moved to the eastern wall, where his weapons waited, his movements deliberate and calm despite the racing of his heart. Grimnir's tooth felt strange in his hand after so many years, heavier than he remembered but balanced as perfectly as the day he had first drawn it from the forge. The blade sang softly as he pulled it from its scabbard, the sound like wind through distant mountains. His mail shirt hung on a wooden peg beside the sword. The iron, rings dark with age, but still sound. He had maintained his equipment with the same care he brought to everything else in his life, oiling the metal, checking for weak links, ensuring that if this day ever came, he would be ready. The shirt settled over his shoulders with familiar weight, and his fingers found the buckles and straps without conscious thought. The footsteps outside grew closer, accompanied now by rough voices, speaking in the dialect of the southern kingdoms. They made no effort to conceal their presence, confident in their numbers and convinced that they faced nothing more dangerous than an elderly hermit. Their leader called out in a voice thick with ale and arrogance, demanding that Einar open his door and submit to their will. "Old man, we know you're in there. Come out and we might let you live." The crude threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Einar had heard similar words before, spoken by men who believed that age meant weakness, that isolation meant helplessness. They would learn the truth soon enough, but he found no joy in the prospect. These were someone's sons, perhaps someone's fathers, driven to this place by desperation or greed, or simple ignorance of who they had chosen to threaten. He looked down at Fenrir and Skjold, who had positioned themselves on either side of the door, waiting for his command. Their yellow eyes held intelligence and loyalty, but also the wild hunger of predators who sensed approaching conflict. They had been raised in peace, but they carried the instincts of their ancestors, wolves who had run with the war bands of ancient kings. The pounding on his door began then, fists and weapons striking the seasoned oak with increasing violence. The raiders shouted threats and demands, their voices growing louder as their confidence swelled. They spoke of what they would do to him, what they would take from his hall, how they would leave nothing but ash and bone when they departed. Einar closed his eyes and felt the weight of years settling on his shoulders like snow. He had hoped to live out his days in peace, to die quietly in his sleep with no blood on his hands and no screams echoing in his dreams. But the world had found him again, as he had always known it would. The ancient iron lock that had protected his solitude for 3 decades would not hold much longer against their assault. Soon he would have to choose surrender to men who understood only violence, or become once again the warrior he had spent 30 years trying to forget. Outside, the pounding continued, and with each blow, another piece of his carefully constructed peace crumbled away. The ancient iron lock finally gave way with a sound like breaking bones, and the heavy oak door swung inward on its leather hinges. 3 men burst through the opening, their weapons drawn and their faces twisted with the savage grin of predators who had cornered their prey. They had expected to find a cowering old hermit, perhaps a handful of silver coins hidden beneath a mattress, maybe a goat or two to slaughter for fresh meat. Instead, they found themselves face to face with Einar Skjoldsson, standing in the center of his hall, with Grimnir's tooth in his hand, and 30 years of accumulated patience burning in his pale blue eyes. The carved wooden rune stone that had served as his meditation focus for 3 decades sat on the mantelpiece behind him, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of contemplation. He had carved it himself during his 2nd winter of exile, seeking some way to channel the rage and grief that threatened to consume him. The stone bore the symbol of the wolf, and the tree representing the balance between wild instinct and deep-rooted wisdom that he had spent his exile trying to achieve. Now that balance was about to be tested. The first raider through the door was the largest, a bear of a man with arms like tree trunks and a beard that hung to his chest in greasy tangles. His name was Ulf the Red, though the blood that had earned him that title had long since washed away, leaving only the reputation and the hunger for more. He carried a war axe that had seen better days, its edge chipped and its handle wrapped with leather strips to hide the cracks in the wood. "Well, well," Ulf rumbled, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had bullied his way through life and expected today to be no different. "Looks like the old goat has some fight left in him after all." Behind him came his companions, Thorvald the Quick, a wiry man with the shifting eyes of a born thief, and Bjorn Iron Fist, whose massive hands bore the scars of too many tavern brawls to count. They spread out across the hall's entrance, blocking any escape, while their eyes catalogued the wealth they saw around them, the weapons on the wall, the silver drinking cups on the table, the fine furs that covered the sleeping alcove. "Put down the sword, old man," Thorvald said, his voice high and nervous despite his attempt at bravado. "We're not here to hurt you, just to take what we need and be on our way." Einar said nothing, but his grip shifted slightly on Grimnir's tooth, his thumb finding the familiar groove in the pommel where it had rested during 100 battles. The weight of the blade felt strange after so many years, but the balance was perfect, and his body remembered skills that his mind had tried to bury. Fenrir and Skjold had positioned themselves in the shadows near the eastern wall, their pale eyes fixed on the intruders with predatory intensity. The raiders hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on the old man and his sword to pay attention to what might be lurking in the darker corners of the hall. It was a mistake that would cost them dearly. "This is your chance," Einar said finally, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once commanded kings. "Leave now, with your lives and your limbs intact. Take nothing that belongs to me, and I'll let you walk away." The 3 raiders exchanged glances, and Ulf's laughter filled the hall like the sound of grinding stone. "Listen to him, boys. The old fool thinks he can threaten us." He hefted his axe, testing its weight. "I've killed men half your age who thought they were warriors. What makes you think you can stand against 3 of us?" "Experience," Einar replied simply. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and threat. Ulf's grin faltered slightly, something in the old man's tone penetrating his alcohol-fueled confidence. For a moment, the hall was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant whistle of wind through the trees. Then Thorvald made his move. He lunged forward with a rusted seax, aiming for Einar's ribs in a quick thrust that had served him well in back-alley ambushes. But Einar was no drunken merchant or sleeping farmer. The old warrior stepped aside with fluid grace, his body moving with the muscle memory of countless battles. And Grimnir's tooth swept in a silver arc that opened Thorvald's throat before the younger man even realized his attack had failed. The thief collapsed to the wooden floor, his blood spreading across the planks that Einar had laid with his own hands. The sight of it red on the golden wood he had polished to a warm glow sent a spike of grief through the old warrior's heart. This hall had been a place of peace for 30 years, and now it was baptized once again in violence and death. Ulf roared his fury and charged with his axe raised high, but Bjorn Ironfist hesitated, suddenly understanding that they had walked into something far more dangerous than an isolated hermit's hut. That moment of hesitation saved his life, at least temporarily, as the wolves finally revealed themselves. Fenrir erupted from the shadows like a grey thunderbolt, his massive form slamming into Bjorn's back and driving the raider to the floor. The man's screams echoed off the halls, rafters as claws raked across his leather armor, finding the gaps and drawing bright lines of blood across his skin. Skoll circled around behind Ulf, cutting off his retreat, yellow eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was altogether more than animal. Ulf's charge faltered as he found himself caught between the old warrior and the massive wolf, his confidence crumbling like a castle built on sand. The axe trembled in his hands as he realized that what he had thought was prey had turned into predators, and the hunt had suddenly reversed itself. "I gave you a choice," Einar said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You chose poorly." The carved rune stone on the mantelpiece caught the firelight, its worn surface seeming to glow with an inner light. For 30 years, it had reminded him of the balance he sought between his wild nature and his desire for peace. Now, as blood stained his floor and the wolves of his heart were unleashed once more, that balance tilted toward something darker and more primitive. The old warrior was awakening, and Ulf the Red was beginning to understand just how badly he had misjudged his prey. Bjorn Ironfist's screams echoed through the hall as Fenrir's claws raked across his back, the wolf's weight pinning him to the blood-slicked floor. The raider thrashed desperately, trying to reach the long knife at his belt, but the massive predator had positioned himself with the calculating precision of a creature born to hunt. Every movement Bjorn made only drove the claws deeper, painting new lines of crimson across his torn leather vest. Einar's silver arm ring caught the firelight as he raised Grimnir's tooth, the ancient band of twisted metal gleaming like a serpent around his weathered bicep. He had worn it for 47 years, since the day he had earned his place among the chosen warriors of King Ragnar's hall. The arm ring had been forged from silver, taken in the great raid on Lindisfarne, blessed by the Skalds, and marked with runes that promised victory to its bearer. Now it served as a reminder of the oaths he had sworn and broken, the life he had abandoned, and the skills that had never truly left him despite 3 decades of deliberate neglect. Ulf the Red stood frozen between Einar and Skoll, his axe trembling in hands that had suddenly lost their certainty. The big raider's eyes darted between the old warrior's blade and the wolf's bared fangs, trying to calculate odds that shifted with each passing heartbeat. Behind him, Bjorn's struggles were growing weaker, though whether from blood loss or Fenrir's crushing weight was impossible to tell. "You're not just some hermit," Ulf said, his voice cracking like a boy's despite his 40 winters. "Who are you, old man?" "I am someone who wanted to be left alone," Einar replied, stepping forward with the measured pace of a man who had learned patience through blood and sorrow. "Someone who hoped the world had forgotten his name and his deeds. But you couldn't let sleeping wolves lie, could you?" The silver arm ring seemed to grow warm against his skin, as if responding to the awakening of instincts he had tried so hard to bury. It carried the weight of memory battles fought beside men whose names were now carved on memorial stones, victories that had cost more than defeat ever could, and the terrible knowledge that some songs were written in blood that could never be washed away. Skjold circled closer to Ulf, moving with the liquid grace of a natural predator. The wolf's yellow eyes never left the raider's face, reading the micro-expressions that betrayed fear, desperation, and the growing realization that death had entered the hall wearing fur instead of mail. The creature had learned patience from his master, but beneath that patience lay the same capacity for sudden, overwhelming violence. "Bjorn!" Ulf called to his companion, but received only a weak groan in response. Fenrir had shifted his position, and now the raider lay motionless beneath the wolf's bulk, his breathing shallow and labored. Whether he lived or died would depend on choices made in the next few moments, and everyone in the hall understood the stakes with crystal clarity. "Let him go," Ulf demanded, raising his axe with shaking hands. "Call off your beasts and let us leave. We'll tell no one where you are or what happened here." Einar's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Your word, the oath of a man who breaks into another's home and threatens his life." He shook his head slowly. "I gave you the chance to leave with honor intact. That opportunity has passed like snow before the spring thaw." The old warrior moved closer, and Ulf finally swung his axe in a wild, desperate arc. But the stroke was born of panic rather than skill, telegraphed by the tension in his shoulders and the wideness of his stance. Einar had seen such attacks countless times, the flailing of men who had relied on intimidation and overwhelming numbers rather than genuine prowess. Grimnir's tooth met the axe handle just below the head, the ancient steel shearing through seasoned ash like it was brittle ice. The axe blade spun away across the hall, embedding itself in the wooden wall with a solid thunk that seemed to echo like thunder in the sudden silence. Ulf stared at the broken handle in his hands, the splintered wood still vibrating from the impact. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water, and for the first time in his violent life he understood what it meant to be truly helpless in the presence of superior skill. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "I have children, a wife who depends on me." The plea cut through Einar's resurgent battle fury like a blade through silk. He had heard similar words before, spoken by enemies who moments earlier had shown no mercy to others. The silver arm ring seemed to grow heavier on his arm, weighted with the memories of all the men who had knelt before him and begged for the lives they had been so eager to take from others. "Then you should have thought of them before you chose this path," Einar said, but his voice had lost some of its hard edge. "A man who would rob and murder to feed his family is still a robber and a murderer. But a father has responsibilities that a childless man cannot understand." Skjold sensed the change in his master's mood and tensed, waiting for the command that would end the threat permanently. The wolf's loyalty was absolute, but his intelligence was sufficient to recognize the conflict in the old warrior's heart. Mercy and justice warred in Einar's pale eyes, each pulling him toward a different choice. The silver arm ring caught the light again, as Einar raised his sword, the blade's point coming to rest against Ulf's throat. The raider closed his eyes, waiting for the bite of steel that would send him to whatever fate awaited beyond the veil of death. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or simply the names of his children, whispered into the space between one heartbeat and the next. But the killing stroke never came. Instead, Einar stepped back, his decision made. The silver arm ring had reminded him not just of his capacity for violence, but of the code that had governed his actions when he wore it with pride. Honor demanded justice, but wisdom counseled mercy for those who could still choose a different path. "You have a choice to make, Ulf the Red," he said quietly, "and the next few moments will determine whether your children grow up with a father or a memory." The choice Einar offered hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with possibility and consequence. Ulf the Red knelt on the blood-stained floor of the hall, his broken axe handle still clutched in trembling hands, while Skjold maintained his predatory circle and Fenrir kept Bjorn pinned beneath his massive weight. The moment stretched between mercy and justice, between the man Einar had been and the one he had tried to become. His bone-handled eating knife lay on the great table where he had left it that morning, its simple blade worn smooth by decades of daily use. The knife had been carved from the antler of the first elk he had taken in his valley, shaped during the long winter nights when loneliness threatened to drive him back to the world of men. It represented the honest simplicity he had sought in exile, a tool for sustaining life rather than taking it, crafted for nourishment rather than destruction. Now, it served as a reminder of what he stood to lose if he allowed the old warrior to fully awaken within him. "I'll give you the same chance I gave your companions," Einar said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Swear on whatever you hold sacred that you'll abandon this path. Take your friend," he nodded toward Bjorn, who had fallen unconscious beneath Fenrir's bulk, "and return to your family. Never again raise your hand against those who cannot defend themselves." Ulf's eyes darted around the hall, taking in the wealth that surrounded him, the silver cups, the fine weapons, the warm furs that spoke of comfort beyond anything he had known. His family lived in a one-room hovel where the wind whistled through gaps in the walls, and his children went to sleep hungry more often than fed. The temptation to grab what he could and fight his way out burned in his chest like swallowed coals. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Einar's hand tightened on Grimnir's tooth, the familiar weight of the weapon settling into his palm like a missing piece of his soul. "Then you join your friend Thorvald in the sleep that has no waking, and your children grow up believing their father died with honor instead of learning the truth about what he really was." The firelight danced across the bone handle of the eating knife, highlighting the careful workmanship that had gone into its creation. Einar remembered the night he had finished it, sitting alone before his hearth, while snow fell outside and the wolves slept at his feet. He had been trying to carve away the parts of himself that belonged to war and violence, seeking to create something purely functional and peaceful. But peace, he was learning, was a luxury that required constant vigilance to maintain. "I swear," Ulf said suddenly, his voice cracking with desperation and something that might have been genuine remorse. "By my children's lives, by my wife's honor, I swear I'll return to them and find another way to provide. No more raiding, no more theft. Just let me take Bjorn and go." The oath hung between them, and Einar studied the younger man's face for signs of deception. He had heard many such promises over the years, from enemies seeking to buy time, from allies trying to avoid difficult duties, from himself when he stood before the altar of his own conscience and swore to leave violence behind forever. Some oaths were kept, others broken before the words finished echoing, and the challenge lay in knowing which was which. Fenrir looked to his master, waiting for instruction. The wolf's intelligence was sufficient to understand that the dynamics in the hall had shifted, that the immediate threat had passed, but his instinct still demanded resolution. Prey that was wounded but not finished posed ongoing danger, and every fiber of his being urged him to complete what had been started. But Einar had spent 30 years teaching his companions that wisdom sometimes demanded restraint, that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in knowing when destruction was necessary and when it was merely convenient. "Fenrir, release," he commanded quietly. The great wolf stepped back from Bjorn's motionless form, his yellow eyes never leaving the unconscious raider's face. Blood seeped from claw marks across the man's back and shoulders, but the wounds were painful rather than fatal, a precise application of force that spoke to the wolf's training and discipline. Bjorn would live, though he would carry the scars as a reminder of this day for the rest of his life. Ulf crawled across the floor to his companion, checking for signs of life with hands that shook from more than cold. Bjorn's breathing was shallow but steady, and his pulse fluttered weakly beneath his jaw. He would need care and rest, but he would survive to face whatever choices his brush with death might inspire. "Can you carry him?" Einar asked, though his tone suggested it was less a question than a statement of expectation. Yes, Ulf replied, hauling Bjorn's unconscious form across his shoulders with the practiced ease of a man who had carried wounded comrades before. I can manage. The bone-handled knife gleamed in the firelight as Einar moved to the table, his free hand resting on its simple surface. The contrast between the elegant weapon in his right hand and the humble tool beneath his left perfectly captured the duality that had defined his exile, the constant tension between what he had been and what he tried to be. "Before you go," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority that made Ulf freeze despite his burden, "look around this hall. See what you came to steal." Ulf's eyes swept the interior of the dwelling, taking in details that desperation and greed had caused him to overlook earlier. The weapons on the wall were not mere decorations, but working tools, maintained with the care of someone who understood their true purpose. The books spoke of learning pursued for its own sake rather than practical advantage. The simple furniture showed the marks of craftsmanship born from patience and pride rather than urgent necessity. This is what a life looks like when a man chooses to build rather than take, Einar continued. When he creates value instead of stealing it from others. Everything you see here was earned through honest work and careful planning. Nothing was taken from those who had less. The lesson hung in the air like morning mist, neither accusation nor judgment, but simply truth presented for consideration. Ulf's face reddened with shame as he understood the implications that the man he had tried to rob had achieved through legitimate means, what Ulf sought through violence and theft. The bone-handled knife represented the choice that lay before every man who found himself at a crossroads between honor and expedience. 3 days passed before the ravens came. Einar spotted them from his morning perch at the water's edge, black shapes circling high above the eastern pass like harbingers of approaching storm. Ravens meant carrion, and carrion in these mountains usually meant travelers who had misjudged the weather, the terrain, or the predators that called this wilderness home. But these birds flew with purpose rather than hunger, their cries carrying an intelligence that spoke of messages rather than mere scavenging. His worn leather journal lay open on the wooden bench beside him, its pages filled with careful observations accumulated over 30 years of solitude. Weather patterns, animal migrations, the subtle signs that warned of avalanche or flood, all meticulously recorded in the neat script of a man who had learned to read the natural world as thoroughly as he once read the faces of enemies across a battlefield. The journal had been a gift to himself during his 3rd winter of exile, when the silence of the mountains had threatened to drive him to madness. Writing had become his anchor to sanity, a way to impose order on the chaos of memory and regret that plagued his darkest hours. Each entry was a small victory against the despair that whispered he was nothing more than a forgotten relic of forgotten wars. Now the journal served a different purpose, reminding him of patterns and cycles that might explain why. Carrion birds circled where no carrion should be. "Fenrir," he called softly, and the great wolf padded to his side, yellow eyes fixed on the distant specks against the pale morning sky. "What do you make of that?" The wolf's hackles rose slightly, a subtle response to some scent or sound that Einar's human senses could not detect. Skjold joined them moments later, both animals displaying the restless energy that had become familiar over the past few days. They sensed something approaching, not the immediate danger that had preceded the raiders' arrival, but something larger and more complex. Einar's fingers traced the journal's margin where he had recorded Ulf's departure. The man had kept his word, carrying his unconscious companion down the mountain path without looking back. But oaths sworn in desperation were fragile things, easily broken when the immediacy of danger faded and the old hungers reasserted themselves. Had Ulf truly meant his promise, or had he simply said what was necessary to preserve his life? The answer might be circling overhead in the form of those ravens. He closed the journal and made his way back to the hall, the wolves flanking him with their usual silent efficiency. Inside, Thorvald's blood had been scrubbed from the wooden floor, though dark stains remained in the grain despite Einar's best efforts. The sight of them sent a familiar ache through his chest, another reminder that violence, once invited into a peaceful place, left marks that could never be entirely erased. His spare war gear hung on wooden pegs in the storage alcove, pieces he had hoped never to need again. A second mail shirt, lighter but still effective. A round shield bearing the wolf's head that had been his personal symbol during the campaigns. Throwing axes balanced for accuracy rather than raw power, a long sea axe for close fighting when a sword became unwieldy. The gear had been maintained with the same meticulous care he brought to everything in his domain, but wearing it again felt like putting on the skin of a man he had tried to bury. Each piece carried memories of specific battles, particular enemies, moments when the difference between life and death had been measured in heartbeats and inches of steel. As he buckled the lighter mail over his woolen tunic, Einar found himself remembering the last time he had donned war gear with the expectation of violence. It had been at Thornhaven in the hours before Magnus died, and his own faith in the righteousness of warfare crumbled to ash. He had been so certain then that his cause was just, his methods necessary, his victory inevitable. The worn leather journal seemed to watch him from the table, its innocent pages holding the record of a man who had tried to become something other than a killer. 30 years of careful observation, patient learning, and deliberate growth, all threatened by the possibility that his mercy had been mistaken for weakness, his compassion interpreted as invitation. The raven's cries grew louder, and through the shuttered window he could see more of the black birds settling in the trees around his hall. They came in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups, until the branches bent under their combined weight. The sight sent a chill through Einar's bones that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Ravens gathered for many reasons, but when they came in such numbers to a place where no battle had been fought and no great death had occurred, it usually meant they were following something or someone that brought death with them. Skoll's low growl confirmed his suspicions. The wolf stood at the window, ears forward and body tense, staring at something moving through the distant trees. Einar joined him and felt his heart sink at what he saw there. Men, at least a dozen of them, moving through the forest with the purposeful advance of a hunting party. They were still too far away to make out details, but their formation and approach spoke of military training rather than desperate banditry. These were not random raiders driven by hunger or greed. They were professionals, and they had come to his valley with specific intent. The leather journal lay open to his entry about Ulf's departure, and Einar realized with bitter certainty what had happened. The raider had kept his oath in the letter, if not the spirit, abandoning his life of theft and violence in favor of something potentially far worse. He had sold his information to others, trading knowledge of the isolated hermit and his treasures for whatever coin or favor he could extract. Ulf had found a way to provide for his family without directly breaking his word, but the distinction would matter little when armed men kicked down Einar's door and demanded his submission or his life. The old warrior closed the journal and placed it carefully in the wooden chest where he kept his most precious possessions. If he survived what was coming, he would want to record the lessons learned. If he did not, perhaps someone would find it and understand that even a man who sought peace might be forced to take up arms when peace was no longer an option. Outside, the ravens continued their raucous conversation, and the sound of approaching boots grew steadily louder through the morning air. The lead man emerged from the tree line with his hands raised in a gesture of peace, and Einar's world tilted on its axis like a ship caught in an unexpected gale. Beneath the grey beard and weathered features, beneath the scars and the lines carved by 30 years of hard living, he recognized a face that belonged to ghosts and memories he thought he had buried. Magnus, he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer to gods he had stopped believing in decades ago. His shield brother stepped into the clearing with the careful movements of a man who understood he was walking into a potential battlefield. Behind him came 11 other warriors, their weapons sheathed but ready, their formation speaking of discipline and experience rather than the crude aggression of common raiders. These were not bandits or mercenaries, they were professional soldiers, and they had come to his valley with purpose written in every measured step. The brass compass that had guided Einar through his darkest campaigns lay in the wooden chest beside his bed, its needle pointing true north, just as it had during the siege of Jorvik and the Battle of the Three Rivers. Magnus had given it to him on the eve of their first campaign together, when they were young men convinced that honor and courage could solve any problem the world might present. The compass had led them through fog and storm, across hostile territory and through enemy lines, always bringing them home. Now it seemed the compass had guided someone else home as well. "Hello, brother," Magnus called across the clearing, his voice carrying the same warmth that had sustained their friendship through a dozen campaigns and twice as many battles. "You're looking well for a dead man." The words hit Einar like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and setting his mind reeling. Dead. Magnus thought he was dead, just as Einar had believed Magnus had died in his arms at Thornhaven 30 years ago. But the man standing before him was flesh and blood, older and scarred but undeniably alive, breathing the same mountain air and casting the same solid shadow. "I saw you die," Einar said, his voice barely carrying across the distance between them. "I held you while the life drained from your eyes. I spoke the words that should have carried your soul to Valhalla's golden halls." Magnus's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Aye, you did. But the gods, it seems, had other plans for both of us." He gestured to the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a silver line that spoke of steel and suffering. "Your Saxon's blade came close to finishing what started, but Thorhild the healer had skills that neither of us suspected. She pulled me back from the threshold of death, though it took the better part of a year before I could walk without aid." The brass compass seemed to grow heavier in its chest, weighted with the implications of what Magnus was telling him. If his shield brother lived, then everything Einar had built his exile upon, the guilt, the grief, the crushing certainty that his leadership had cost the life of the only man he truly trusted, crumbled like a wall of sand before an incoming tide. "Why didn't you find me?" The question came out sharper than Einar intended, carrying 30 years of accumulated pain. "Why let me believe you were dead?" "Because you had already vanished by the time I could travel," Magnus replied, stepping closer, but keeping his hands visible and empty. "You left Thornhaven the day after the battle, taking nothing but your sword and your shame. By the time I recovered enough to look for you, the trail was months cold, and you had become a ghost story whispered in taverns." Behind Magnus, his men maintained their disciplined formation, but Einar could see the curiosity in their faces. They were hearing a story they had not known, learning details about their leader's past that shed new light on the man they followed. These were not mercenaries bound by coin alone. They carried themselves with the loyalty of men who served someone they respected. "I searched for you," Magnus continued, his voice growing softer as he approached the hall's entrance. "For 10 years, I followed every rumor and tracked down every story of a giant warrior who had vanished from the world. I thought you might be dead, or broken, or simply unwilling to be found, but I never stopped looking." The brass compass had been their shared tool during the campaigns, passed back and forth between them as circumstances demanded. When Magnus navigated, Einar fought. When Einar led the advance, Magnus ensured they had a path of retreat. It had been a perfect partnership, each man complementing the other's strengths and compensating for his weaknesses. Now, Einar realized that the partnership had survived death itself, spanning decades and continents, in the form of Magnus's relentless search for his missing brother. "What changed?" Einar asked. "What brought you to my valley after all these years?" Ulf the Red, Magnus replied with a grimace. He came to my hall 3 days ago with a story about a giant hermit who lived with wolves and fought like the heroes of old songs. The description was too familiar to ignore, and his account of your fighting style left no doubt about your identity. The betrayal cut deeper than Einar had expected. He had shown Ulf mercy, offered him a chance at redemption, and in return received the bitter lesson that desperate men would always choose survival over honor when pressed. But there was something else in Magnus's expression, a complexity that suggested the story had more layers than simple betrayal. I convinced Ulf to guide us here, Magnus continued, but I think you should know he didn't sell the information. He came to me seeking help, claiming that he had encountered someone who might be able to aid him in protecting his family from other raiders. The man was terrified, but not of you. He was afraid that others would learn what he had learned and come hunting for the wolf lord of the mountains. The revelation reframed everything Einar had assumed about Ulf's departure. The raider had not betrayed him for coin or favor. He had sought aid from the one man who might be powerful enough to ensure that Einar's location remained secret. In his desperate attempt to honor his oath, while protecting both his family and his reluctant benefactor, Ulf had inadvertently led Magnus to the valley he had spent 3 decades calling home. "Where is he now?" Einar asked. "I left him at my hall with gold enough to feed his family through the winter and work that will keep them comfortable without requiring theft or violence. His oath to you will be honored, and his children will grow up knowing their father chose righteousness over expedience when it mattered most." The brass compass seemed to pulse in its chest like a living heart, reminding Einar of the bond he had thought broken by death. Magnus stood before him not as an enemy or a threat, but as the brother who had never stopped believing that their friendship could survive any trial the world might impose. But 30 years of separation had changed them both, and the man who faced him across the clearing was no longer the young warrior who had fought beside him at Thornhaven. Magnus commanded his own forces now, carried his own burdens, and had undoubtedly fought battles and made choices that Einar could not begin to imagine. The question that hung between them was whether their bond was strong enough to bridge the gap carved by 3 decades of different paths and separate struggles. Fenrir and Skoll flanked Einar, sensing the emotional turmoil in their master, but uncertain whether the newcomers represented threat or opportunity. The wolves had never known a world where Einar trusted other humans, and their confusion was evident in the way they shifted restlessly, torn between protective instincts and the absence of any immediate danger. "Why have you come, Magnus?" Einar asked finally. "What do you want from a man the world believes is dead?" His shield brother smiled, and for a moment 30 years fell away like morning mist. "The same thing I've always wanted, brother. To stand beside you when the real fight begins." The war council convened in Einar's hall as the sun reached its zenith. 13 battle-tested warriors gathered around the great table where he had eaten his solitary meals for 30 years. Magnus had brought 11 men, each one a veteran of campaigns that had forged reputations in blood and iron. Their names carried weight in the halls of kings. Thorkel the Wise, whose tactical genius had broken the siege of Bergen. Orm the Steady, whose shield wall had never yielded ground. Gunnar Bloodaxe, whose fury in battle was matched only by his loyalty to those he served. They were older now, grey-bearded and scarred, but their eyes still held the sharp intelligence of professional soldiers who had survived where lesser men had fallen. They studied Einar with curiosity and respect, seeing in him the legendary Wolfshield, whose exploits had become songs sung in mead halls across the northern kingdoms. Magnus's iron war standard leaned against the eastern wall, its raven banner stirring slightly in the draught that whispered through the hall's ancient timbers. The standard had flown over a dozen battlefields, marking the position of warriors who had chosen to follow Magnus after Einar's disappearance. It represented the burden of leadership that had fallen on his shield brothers' shoulders, the weight of decisions that affected not just his own fate, but the lives of every man who trusted him. Now that standard stood in Einar's hall, and with it came the knowledge that their reunion was not merely a meeting of old friends, but a convergence of forces that would reshape the balance of power in the region. Jarl Sven the Bloody has claimed the Old Kingdom, Magnus said, unrolling a detailed map across the table's surface. He controls the coastal settlements from Stavanger to Trondheim, and his influence extends inland as far as the Great Forest. His ships patrol the fjords, his tax collectors bleed the villages dry, and his warriors take what they please from those too weak to resist. The map showed the extent of Sven's growing dominion, marked in red ink that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Einar traced the boundaries with his finger, noting how the controlled territory crept closer to his valley with each passing season. It would not be long before even the most remote settlements fell under the bloody Jarl's shadow. "He knows about you," Thorkel said, his weathered face grim with the implications. Ulf's story reached other ears before Magnus could silence them. Sven has heard tales of the Wolfshield's return, and he remembers the old days when your name could rally the small jarls against a common threat. Einar felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. He had hoped to live out his days in peaceful obscurity, but the past had a way of reclaiming those who tried to escape it. Sven the Bloody had been a young warrior during Einar's active years, ambitious and ruthless, but lacking the skill to challenge established powers. 30 years had clearly changed that dynamic. "How many men does he command?" Einar asked, though he suspected he would not like the answer. 300 sworn warriors, Orm replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard intelligence. Perhaps twice that number in levies and mercenaries. His fleet numbers 20 ships, each capable of carrying 40 fighters. He has been building his strength for years, preparing for the day when he could claim the high throne that has remained vacant since King Ragnar's death. The Iron War standard caught the firelight, its raven seeming to spread its wings in anticipation of the feast that would surely come. Einar remembered when Magnus had first raised that banner, in the dark days after Thornhaven, when the survivors of their warband had needed something to rally around. It had been a symbol of defiance then, a declaration that some things were worth fighting for, even when victory seemed impossible. "What does he want from me?" Einar asked, though he already knew the answer. "Your submission or your death," Magnus replied bluntly. He cannot allow the possibility that Einar Skjoldsson might emerge from his exile to challenge his authority. The legend of Wolfshield has grown over the years, becoming larger than the man who earned the name. Songs are sung of your victories, stories are told of your wisdom, and men remember when a true king sat on the throne instead of a bloody usurper. The warriors around the table nodded their agreement, and Einar saw in their faces the hunger for righteous battle that had driven them to follow Magnus across the treacherous mountain paths. These were men who had lived with the shame of serving lesser leaders, who had watched their homeland fall into the hands of a tyrant while remembering better days under better rulers. "When will he come?" Einar asked. "Soon," Gunnar said, his scarred hands tracing patterns on the table's surface. "Our scouts report movement in the southern settlements, ships being provisioned, warriors being gathered, supplies being stockpiled for a winter campaign. Sven knows that time favors you every day. You remain free is another day for your legend to spread, and men to remember what leadership should look like." The Iron War standard seemed to pulse with anticipation, reminding Einar of all the battles he had fought under similar banners. But this would be different. This would not be a campaign of conquest or a clash between rival ambitions. This would be a final reckoning between the world he had left behind and the peace he had tried to build. Magnus leaned forward, his eyes holding the intensity that had made him such an effective battlefield commander. "We cannot win this through conventional warfare, brother. Sven has the numbers, the resources, and the mobility to overwhelm any static defense we might attempt. But we have advantages. He cannot match knowledge of the terrain, the loyalty of the people, and the tactical genius that made you legendary. Around the table, the warriors waited for Einar's response, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and determination. They had followed Magnus into the mountains, seeking the return of a hero, but heroes were made in moments like this, when ordinary men chose to stand against impossible odds for the sake of something greater than themselves. "Show me his approach routes," Einar said finally, accepting the burden that fate had placed upon him. "If Sven the Bloody wants the Wolfshield, then he shall have him, but not in the way he expects." The next several hours passed in intensive planning, as Einar's knowledge of local geography combined with his companion's intelligence about enemy forces and capabilities. The Iron War Standard stood sentinel over their discussions, bearing witness to the birth of a strategy that would either restore rightful rule to the land or see them all dead in glorious failure. By evening, they had crafted a plan that was audacious in its scope and elegant in its simplicity. It would require precise timing, absolute trust, and the kind of calculated risks that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. Most importantly, it would depend on Einar's ability to become once again the man he had been 30 years ago, while retaining the wisdom he had gained during his exile. As the warriors settled in for the night, spreading their bedrolls across the hall's floor, Einar stood outside beneath the star-filled sky and listened to the distant howl of wolves echoing through the valley. Fenrir and Skjold flanked him, sensing the change in their master's mood, understanding that their peaceful existence was about to be tested by forces beyond their control. The Iron War Standard flew above his hall now, marking it as a place where free men gathered to plan the restoration of honor and justice. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the end, either for Sven the Bloody's tyranny or for the last remnants of the old ways. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, Einar Skjoldsson was not alone in his valley, and the weight of leadership no longer rested solely on his shoulders. They came with the dawn, black ships cutting through the morning mist like harbingers of doom. From his vantage point on the ridge above the lake, Einar counted 20 vessels in perfect formation, their red and black sails billowing with wind that carried the scent of salt and steel. Sven the Bloody had brought his entire fleet to this remote valley, transforming the peaceful waters of Lake Draugfell into a staging ground for conquest. His father's battle horn hung at Einar's side, its curved length carved from the ivory of a great whale taken in the northern seas. The horn had sounded across a dozen battlefields, calling warriors to glory and enemies to their doom. King Ragnar himself had blown it at the Battle of the Four Kings, and its voice had rallied the scattered forces of the north when defeat seemed certain. Now it would sound again, carrying a different message across the valley, one of defiance and desperate hope. Sven's warriors disembarked with disciplined efficiency, their mail gleaming in the pale light as they formed ranks on the rocky shore. 300 men-at-arms, just as Magnus had predicted, but Einar could see that the intelligence had been conservative. Additional ships arrived even as he watched, bringing the total force to nearly 400 professional soldiers who moved with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. At their head strode Sven the Bloody himself, his crimson cloak marking him as clearly as a banner. Even at this distance, Einar could see the arrogance in the man's bearing, the casual brutality in the way he gestured toward the hall that had been Einar's home for 3 decades. To Sven, this was just another conquest, another step toward the throne he believed destiny owed him. The usurper had grown since their last meeting 30 years ago. Where once he had been lean and hungry, now he carried himself with the solid confidence of a man who had taken everything he wanted and seen no reason to stop. His personal guard surrounded him 20 warriors whose reputation for savagery had spread across the northern kingdoms like a plague. "Remember the plan," Magnus whispered from his position beside a massive pine tree. His 11 warriors were scattered across the ridge, each man positioned to maximize the effect of their ambush. They were outnumbered 30-1, but the terrain favored defenders who knew every stone and shadow in these mountains. Einar lifted his father's battle horn to his lips and drew the breath that would signal the beginning of the end. The ancient ivory felt warm against his skin, as if it remembered the heat of other battles, other desperate stands where free men had chosen to fight rather than kneel. The horn's voice would carry across the valley, alerting not just his allies, but also the villagers in the settlements below that the time for hiding had passed. But before he could sound the call, movement in the forest below caught his attention. Figures emerged from the tree line, not warriors, but villagers, men, women, and children from Ironwood and the other settlements, carrying whatever weapons they could find. Hunting bows, woodsmen's axes, fishing spears, and old swords that had belonged to their grandfathers. They numbered perhaps 60 in total, farmers and fisherfolk who had heard the songs about Wolfshield and decided that some things were worth dying for. Their leader was an old woman Einar recognized, Astrid the Wise, who had been the settlement speaker for as long as anyone could remember. She raised her walking stick like a war banner and called out in a voice that carried across the water like thunder, "Sven Eriksson, you are not welcome in this valley. These are free lands, and we will not bow to a usurper's crown." The challenge hung in the morning air, brave and futile and utterly magnificent. Sven's response was immediate and predictable, a gesture that sent his archers forward, their bows drawn and arrows nocked. The message was clear: submit or die, but make your choice, quickly. Einar felt something break inside his chest, not from despair, but from a fierce pride that threatened to overwhelm him. These people had lived their entire lives in peace, knowing nothing of war beyond the stories their elders told. Yet when tyranny came to their doorstep, they had chosen to stand rather than kneel, even though they knew it might mean their deaths. His father's battle horn seemed to grow heavier in his hands, weighted with the responsibility of all the lives that hung in the balance. Below, Sven's warriors advanced toward the villagers in a disciplined line, shields locked and spears lowered. The farmers and fisherfolk stood their ground, their makeshift weapons pitifully inadequate against professional soldiers, their courage the only armor they possessed. "Now," Magnus said quietly, "if we're going to act, it has to be now." Einar raised the horn to his lips and blew the call that would transform Lake Drogful from a place of peace into a battlefield, where legends would be born or die forever. The horn's voice rolled across the valley like thunder from a clear sky, ancient and terrible, and filled with the promise that some fights were worth any cost. The horn's call had barely faded when chaos erupted across the valley floor. Magnus and his warriors emerged from concealment like avenging spirits, their war cries echoing off the mountain walls as they struck Sven's flank with devastating precision. Steel rang against steel, and the disciplined ranks of the usurper's army wavered under the unexpected assault from veterans who fought with the fury of men defending their last hope. Einar's grandfather's shield strapped to his left arm, its iron rim polished to mirror brightness after 30 years of careful maintenance. The shield bore the wolf's head that had been his family's symbol for 7 generations, carved deep into seasoned oak and reinforced with bands of the finest steel. It had turned aside Saxon blades at Stamford, bridge deflected Danish axes at the siege of York, and protected 3 generations of warriors who had carried it into battles that lived on in song and story. Now it would face its greatest test, carried by the last man worthy to bear the wolf's head into combat. Fenrir and Skjold bounded down the slope beside their master, no longer domestic companions, but wild predators unleashed upon enemies who threatened their pack. The wolves had grown large on mountain game and careful training, each weighing as much as a grown man and possessing the intelligence to coordinate their attacks with devastating effect. They struck the rear of Sven's formation like grey lightning, scattering archers and creating gaps that Magnus's warriors exploited with surgical precision. Wolfshield, The cry went up from the villagers as they saw Einar descending toward the battle, his mail gleaming and his sword reflecting the morning light like captured fire. Wolfshield has returned. The sound of his bounty, name on their lips, sent strength coursing through his veins like strong wine. For 30 years, he had been simply Einar the Hermit, a forgotten relic of forgotten wars. But in this moment, with his grandfather's shield on his arm and his people's faith in his heart, he became once again the man who had never lost a battle and never abandoned those who trusted him. Sven's personal guard formed a wedge around their lord, pushing through the melee toward where Einar approached. These were no common soldiers, but hand-picked killers who had earned their reputation in a dozen campaigns of rape and pillage. Their leader, a giant named Koll the Kinslayer, wielded a two-handed sword that had supposedly never failed to claim its target. So, the ghost finally shows himself. Sven called out, his voice carrying across the battlefield despite the clash of weapons and screams of the wounded. "I wondered if you would have the courage to face me, old man, or if you would hide in your mountain cave, while others died for your cowardice." The taunt was calculated to provoke rash action, but Einar had learned patience during his long exile. He advanced steadily, his grandfather's shield held high and his sword ready, while around him the battle raged, with the fury of men fighting for everything they held dear. Magnus and his warriors had carved deep into Sven's left flank, but the numbers were still overwhelmingly against them. "I am here," Einar replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded armies and counseled kings. "The question is whether you have the stomach for honest combat, or if you prefer to send others to die for your ambitions." Koll the Kinslayer lunged forward without warning, his massive sword sweeping in an arc designed to cleave Einar from shoulder to hip. But the old warrior's reflexes remained sharp despite his years, and his grandfather's shield intercepted the blow with a crash that rang like thunder. The impact drove him back a step, but the ancient oak held firm, its iron rim scoring a bright line across the Kinslayer's blade. The exchange was merely the opening move in a deadly dance that would determine the fate of the valley and all who called it home. Around them, the battle swirled like a living thing, villagers with farming tools standing beside veterans with battle-tested weapons, all united in their determination to resist tyranny regardless of the cost. Fenrir's howl cut through the din, as the great wolf brought down one of Sven's champions, his teeth finding the gap in the man's mail and ending his life in an instant. Skoll moved like a shadow through the chaos, striking and vanishing before his targets could respond, leaving confusion and terror in his wake. The grandfather's shield absorbed another crushing blow from Koll's sword, and Einar felt the impact jar his bones despite the shield's perfect construction. But with each exchange, he read his opponent's patterns, learning the rhythm of a fighting style built on overwhelming force rather than subtle technique. The Kinslayer was strong and experienced, but he had never faced anyone like Einar Skjoldsson in his prime, let alone Einar Skjoldsson fighting for the lives of people he had sworn to protect. The real battle was just beginning. The battle's end came not with a thunderous clash, but with a moment of perfect silence that seemed to stretch across eternity. Koll the Kinslayer lay dead at Einar's feet, his mighty sword broken by Grimnir's tooth in their final exchange. Sven the Bloody knelt in the mud beside the lake, his crimson cloak torn and bloodied, Magnus's blade at his throat, while the remnants of his once proud army surrendered or fled into the forest. The victory had cost them dearly. Of the 60 villagers who had answered Astrid's call, barely half remained standing, and several of Magnus's veterans would never see another battle. But they had prevailed, and the valley would remain free. His mother's gold wedding ring rested on a leather cord around Einar's neck, hidden beneath his mail throughout the battle. She had given it to him on her deathbed, making him promise that he would remember the importance of building something lasting rather than simply destroying what others had built. The ring bore no gems or elaborate engravings, just the simple band of gold that had symbolized her marriage to his father and her faith that love could endure even the darkest times. Now, as he stood among the wounded and the dead, Einar understood what his mother had tried to teach him. Victory in battle meant nothing if it was not followed by the patient work of healing and rebuilding. The real test would come in the days and years ahead, when they would need to transform this moment of triumph into something worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible. "What would you have me do with him?" Magnus asked, his sword still pressed against Sven's throat. The usurper's eyes burned with hatred, but he had the sense to remain silent while his fate was decided. Around them, his surviving warriors waited with their weapons cast aside, their future depending on the mercy of men they had come to destroy. Einar looked down at Sven, seeing in the defeated jarl a reflection of what he himself might have become if he had chosen ambition over honor, conquest over justice. The temptation to end the threat permanently whispered in his ear, promising that a quick stroke would ensure this challenge never arose again. But his mother's ring pressed warm against his chest, reminding him of lessons learned during 30 years of exile. The cycle of violence that had defined the old ways needed to be broken if anything meaningful was to grow from this day's work. "Strip him of his titles and his lands," Einar said finally. "Give him a small boat and enough supplies to reach distant shores. Let him live, but let him live, knowing that his ambitions died here in this valley, and that the people he tried to enslave chose freedom over fear." Magnus raised an eyebrow but lowered his sword, trusting his shield brother's judgment even when he might have chosen differently. "And his men? Those who wish to swear new oaths and serve honorable lords may do so. The rest are free to go, but they leave their weapons behind, and they never return to these lands." Einar's voice carried the authority of a king, though he wore no crown and claimed no throne. "This valley has seen enough blood for one lifetime." The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees as they tended to their wounded and counted their dead. Astrid the Wise had survived the battle, though a Danish axe had left her walking with a more pronounced limp. She approached Einar as he sat by the lakeshore, cleaning Grimnir's tooth with a cloth that came away stained with other men's blood. "The villagers will need leadership," she said without preamble. "Someone to speak for us when the kings send their tax. Collectors, someone to settle disputes and ensure that justice is done fairly. We would be honored if you would accept the position." Einar looked out across the lake, where Sven's abandoned ships sat at anchor, their black hulls reflecting the afternoon light like sleeping dragons. The prospect of leadership beckoned the chance to build something lasting in this valley, to create the kind of just rule he had dreamed of during his years of exile. But his mother's ring reminded him of simpler truths. Sometimes the greatest service a man could provide was knowing when to step aside and let others find their own path forward. "I'm honored by your trust," he said gently, "but my fighting days are over. Choose a leader from among yourselves, someone young enough to grow with the responsibility and wise enough to remember that power serves the people, not the reverse. I'll be here if you need counsel, but the future belongs to those who will live to see it." Magnus settled beside him, on the wooden dock, his own wounds binding but not serious. "So what will you do now, brother? The world knows you're alive again. There will be others who come seeking the Wolfshield's aid, others who remember when your name meant something." Einar smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that had nothing to do with removing his armor. "I'll do what I've always done here. Fish in the morning, tend my garden in the afternoon, and read by the fire in the evening. The only difference is that now I won't be alone." His mother's ring caught the light as he pulled it from beneath his mail, the simple gold band gleaming like captured sunlight. He had carried it through 30 years of exile and into one final battle, but its true purpose had always been to remind him of what mattered most, not the glory of victory, but the patient work of building a life worth living. As the sun set over Lake Draugfell, painting the water in shades of amber and gold, Einar Skjoldsson sat with his shield brother and his wolves, watching the valley settle into the peace they had fought so hard to preserve. The battle was over, but the real work of living had only just begun.